Okay, welcome everybody. I have the tough task of, in less than 20 minutes, trying to do justice to this 10-site, multi-year, multi-cohort study design. So please bear with me. We will have time for questions a little bit later. So I am here to represent the NCRECE study team to talk a little bit about the core study that was part of our work, which we called the Professional Development Study, and to discuss a little bit the types of teacher and child outcomes we got from an intent to treat design. And of course, thanks to IES for the funding and support of this work over the last 5 or 6 years. I have too many people, many of which are in this room, to thank. This was also a multi-site investigator endeavor, and so we have a lot of partners in this. So we started this work 6 or 7 years ago based on some of the observational work that had been done in preschool classrooms across the country that showed that the interactions between teachers and children in the classrooms were a powerful mechanism for children learning, both on the social side and on the academic side. And these seem to be categorized under things like emotional support, organization of the classroom, and sort of rich instructionally supportive interactions. And these observations showed that we were doing a decent job on a scale from 1 to 7 around the emotionally supportive and classroom organization type interactions, but that the instructional support in particular was much lower than we'd like to see for helping to support children's learning. And so what we did with this study then was to try to put together a couple different approaches to in-service professional development to try to engage these types of interactions and move them up the scale, particularly in that blue category down on the bottom of the graph. So Bob already mentioned this. We were basically testing 2 different kinds of PD support. So one, which I'll refer to as phase 1, was an in-service course, which is something I'll tell you a little bit more about, but think of it as a typical 14-week college course that we actually developed in the early parts of this funding and then tested. And it's very much focused on having teachers think about and observe in videos how interactions during language and literacy kinds of activities might help children learn those skills. Then we also had a second phase, another intervention, which was a coaching intervention called My Teaching Partner. And this was implemented with local coaches that we trained, where teachers videotaped themselves and got feedback on their particular interactions with their children in their classroom. Okay? So to give you a little more depth into each of these, and I'm happy to tell you more later on if you have questions about it. But the course itself was built to essentially improve teachers' observation of the moment-to-moment interactions that they're having with children, and to really think about how they're using these interactions in order to best implement language and literacy content. And so we wanted them to be able to see, through observing lots and lots of teaching examples on video of other teachers across the country, the connection between what an adult in the classroom does and how children are responding, and the contingencies between those that help to build learning over time. So this was a 14-week course. Each session was 3 hours long. We had a team that trained instructors, many of whom were local to the 10 communities we worked with, but it was very standardized. There was a manual, standardized PowerPoints and videos that were shown, and regular support, weekly support from somebody on our study team. And as much as possible, we were partnering with local 2-year and 4-year colleges so that these were credit-bearing courses for teachers that were engaged. So some of you may already know a little bit about the coaching model we tested. Again, this is called MTP. This was really having teachers focus explicitly on their own interactions with kids in the classroom. And so we wanted them, again, to be practicing and getting feedback on implementing particular patterns of interactions with their children in order to help them learn early social skills and language and literacy skills. So this is a one-on-one coaching. We hired and trained folks who were local to the programs. And basically, there was a 2-week cycle. You probably can't see this because it's tiny, but teachers videotape themselves and their kids during a language and literacy activity. The coach then took this, looked at the video, posted online a couple pieces for the teacher to pay attention to, and prompted the teacher to think about the connection between his or her behavior and what the children were responding to. The teacher had a chance to respond online, and they then had a remote conference, often by phone, in which they had a discussion about that interchange on the video and created an action plan for the teacher to move forward. And all of this was done using a shared framework of thinking about effective interactions based off of some of our observation work with the CLASS tool. So they're using a common language, thinking about the different kinds of interactions that teachers are having with kids, and trying to move the needle on those in areas that the teachers were ready to move on. So again, these coaches were closely supervised and monitored. They had a manual that they were following, and it had weekly and monthly support, both individually and in groups with our team. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about the design. So at the very beginning of the study, which I'll talk about as phase 1, we had a large group of teachers that were randomly selected to either get the course that I described or to be in a business as usual control group. So that occurred, and at the end of that, we then put all the teachers back into the same pool and re-randomized them during a second phase into either receiving the MTP coaching or not. Okay? So that resulted in these 4 categories, right? You either got the course and then coaching afterwards, or you got the course and then nothing, or you got nothing and then coaching, and then there's a group that actually didn't have anything across the whole study. Then we had a third phase in which intervention actually was not going on, but we followed these same teachers and their next cohort of children into the following year. And so we have some data on that as well. So to give you some flavor of who we were working with, Bob talked a little bit about this. We recruited at the site level and then at the teacher level. And these sites are in several, a bunch of different states across the country. They're usually large early childhood programs in more urban areas. A lot of them have Head Start funding, and a good chunk of them were also located in schools. They were largely urban, but we did have several more rural or suburban sites as well. Our teachers, and this is the group that actually consented, and of course there's variability in their engagement, which both myself and Jennifer will talk about a little bit later this morning. But you see there's a good bit of variability in their background in terms of their training, as well as the amount of teaching experience that they have, as well as their kind of racial and ethnic background. So this was a wide variety of teachers that we were working with. So before I move on to tell you about the intent to treat results, I want to point out that we did independent checks on the basic fidelity to the model, both for the course instructors and for our coaches. And so what you see here, this was on a scale from 0, you could get a 0, 1, or a 2. And you can see that over the course of the course sessions, each line represents an instructor. We had really good fidelity, independently observed off of videotape, to what we were asking them to do. And you can see essentially the same pattern for our coaches, where we had somebody independently monitor them. And again, this was on the scale of the percentage of ratings that they were doing what we were expecting. Again, so I simply put this up here to show across these 10 sites, a very complicated group of folks we were working with from different backgrounds. We had a team that was regularly helping to support implementation, and so at least at this top level, we felt like we were doing a solid job of making that happen. Okay, so now we're on to impacts. We'll start with teacher impacts, and I'm going to start just at the beginning, during the first phase. So we're comparing the people that got the course to folks who are business as usual. So let me walk you through this. The 3 outcomes we're talking about here are things that we assessed at the end of the course phase, phase 1. We're looking at self-report of beliefs about how important it is to have rich interactions with children as a way of helping children learn. We also have a knowledge measure of the kinds of effective interactions that help children learn. And then we also created a measure that looks at how well a teacher can actually watch some footage and observe the kinds of interactions that are effective in helping children learn language and literacy skills. And so these were the three of the things we were looking at. And what you see is at the end of receiving the course group was stronger than the control group with moderate to large effect sizes for all three of these things. We then followed up in the second phase after the coaching was done. So this was a year later, and you see we don't have a sustained effect in beliefs, but we do have a sustained effect in both knowledge and this ability to see effective interactions. And this is, again, almost a year, in some cases longer than a year later. So the second piece we looked at was actual observed practice and how effective teachers were being in their interactions with children. And I've got an added time point in here just to make it a little more complicated. So again, the light-colored bars are at the end of receiving the course. The darker colors are about 6 to 8 months later, and then the final piece is about a year or so later. And so what you see is immediately after the course, you see pretty stark differences between the teachers that did have the course and those who did not. Anywhere from a lower effect size in classroom organization to a pretty good size effect for instructional support. And then you also see, interestingly, that 6 to 8 months later, at least in the instructional support area, you're seeing some maintenance of gains. And remember, this is from a course that's focused almost explicitly on watching other teachers teaching and getting good at watching that. Very little emphasis on your own teaching and like going in and practicing things. So I think that's a pretty interesting maintenance effect. But by the time you get a year or so out, you see effects on all three of these have gone away. So let's switch to the coaching model. So these are the same three: beliefs, knowledge, and seeing outcomes. We didn't get any effects at all at the end of the coaching phase on any of these three things. So we did find it with the course, but we don't find it for the coaching. When we look at effects of the coaching on changes in practice, however, what we don't get the light colored here for coaching is actually a mid-year, halfway through the coaching. You don't see any effects midway through, but by the end of the year, we have this moderate to large size effect, particularly in instructional support. And I bring you back to that first slide I showed to show how meaningful this is that how low these are in general across the population of early childhood teachers. And so we're really moving the needle on that pretty significantly. But not getting much movement. A little bit of movement on emotional support, but not statistically significant, and nothing going on the classroom organization level. Okay, so those are some of the main impact findings on the teacher outcomes we were most interested in. I'm going to talk for a second about impacts on children. So children were assessed both during the second phase when the coaching was happening, and then we also assessed a second cohort of kids the year after all the interventions were over in these same classrooms. And so where we're seeing positive impacts, one is when we observe the engagement of an individual child with their teacher or the other adults in their classroom. We're seeing a small effect on that. And then we're also seeing a small effect on inhibitory control in the kids in the coaching condition. We do get one effect also on the combination of both courses and coaching around this idea of persistence or engagement as rated by the teachers. But we don't get any course impacts on child outcomes at all. Now keep in mind that there's a delay between the course and the assessment of child outcomes, but we don't get any course impacts. And we don't get effects of any condition on actually a lot of the other things we assessed, either directly or asking teachers to rate, either in the area of language or early literacy skills, and some other more social types of assessments. So that gives you a good sense. The other thing I want to point out, which I think I glossed over a little bit, is we also didn't have any teacher impacts on the combined condition of both coaching and having the course. So in fact, we had a lot of the teacher impacts that I showed, but only you didn't get much additional bang for the buck when we pushed those two things together, which was one of the main hypotheses that we had, that you would actually be able to see a ramping up of effects at the teacher and the child level. And we're seeing a tiny bit of that at the child level, but not any of it at the teacher level, which I think is something I'd like to throw out there as part of our discussion at the end of the session. So I showed you early on that we felt like we had pretty strong implementation fidelity around our course instructors and our coaches. But given that, there's still a lot of, I think Bob called it, sort of local variability. And variability around what teachers were doing. And I want to point that out because I think there are things we need to learn about this that might help us explain both some of our positive findings and some of the null findings. So this is just to point out the variability in what teachers did and within our conditions. So these are the number of course sessions, the percentage of teachers in our sample that completed. So, you know, a lot of them are completing 85, 90 to 100% of our course sessions, but there's definitely variability in there. You see the same thing when you look at the number of coaching cycles completed. So we were aiming for 10 to 12, which is essentially what we got, but there's some folks who had quite a bit more than that, and clearly some who had quite a bit less than that. We also started to unpack the impacts on teachers by site. So we have these 10 different sites, correct? So you see on the bottom here would be each one of these represents a different site. And on the left we've got effect size, and we're just looking at instructional support at this point. So you can see we have some sites that have, you know, tremendously high effect sizes and others that basically have a zero effect. And so if you think back to what I showed you, the average is at about a 0.67 effect. But you're just seeing vast differences. And there's clearly things going on in each of these sites which we haven't measured well enough. Because believe me, we've done some digging and we're trying to figure out if there's some particular conditions under which you see some of these effects. And so I think we need to be doing a good bit more thought and digging around that issue. Another spot where we're seeing differences in impact. So this is, again, instructional support is the outcome. But this time we're looking at coaches. So we have 15 different coaches along the bottom here. And again, effect size is on the left. And you can just see a lot of different, you know, clearly positive impacts across the board, but we have, you know, in one case actually a negative effect from a particular coach and others that are slightly smaller. So again, we're seeing a lot of variability in the impacts across things like site and coach, despite our efforts to implement things well. So a bunch of implications out of this, and I hope I've set up some conversations for later this morning. But we're clearly seeing that coursework by itself and coaching by itself do hold promise for impacting teacher practice, particularly around the instructionally supportive interactions, which have been so challenging to move in a positive direction in the field. So we're very encouraged by that. And there's some, it also seems like there may be some different mechanisms by which each of these are changing teacher behavior. So, you know, if you think about the effects of the course was changing a set of beliefs, a set of knowledge around effective interactions, and the ability to actually see effective interactions happening in the moment in other teachers. And we've done some mediational analysis that shows that, that in fact, those factors, particularly the seeing part, mediates the impact of condition on teachers' practice. So there's something about the course that's operating around something internal to teachers around their skills, knowledge, and beliefs that may be leading to practice change. Whereas in the coaching, we didn't get any impacts on those beliefs, knowledge, and seeing. We got direct impacts. Well, perhaps there are unseen things that we didn't measure, but it appears that we have direct impacts on practice. So there's something there that's a different process that's changing. And so trying to think about some future study designs and some treatment untreated analyses to unpack that a bit. Another thing that's quite clear is that we need to do a better job of discerning under what kinds of conditions an increase in these effective interactions actually produce child outcomes. So we now have, you know, over a decade of research that shows when you look cross-sectionally and even longitudinally in just a non-experimental way that if you observe these kinds of interactions, they're linked to positive child outcomes, both in the social and the academic realm. And then we show here that we can move, particularly instructional interactions, quite significantly. And yet we're still seeing very few impacts on child outcomes. And starting to think about, what are some things at the site level that we're not doing a very good job of figuring out where there's variability that may be particular conditions that help that connection to be stronger. And then the last piece, which John's going to talk a good bit more about, is just beginning to think about, we were sort of on the cusp of going to scale, as Bob described. It certainly wasn't an effectiveness trial, but we were doing this across a lot of different sites where a lot of different things were going on, a lot of different auspices. And so there's this balancing act between providing a really standardized, manualized kind of program and intervention, but also knowing that there are a lot of local variability around administrative support, around the types of curriculum and supports for early learning standards in different states, that we need to figure out how to connect those things and balance those things so that when we have an effective practice, you can take it to scale in effective ways that both changes teacher practice but also is able to support children's learning. So I believe that is all the time that I have. So thank you for listening. Appreciate it.